The sound under the metal. The vibration started halfway through the backstretch. Not violent at first, just a strange tremor under the steering column that made Mateo Ruiz loosen his grip for half a second before tightening it again. The stock car drifted slightly entering turn 3, the rear suspension shuddering beneath him like something underneath the chassis had come loose and was trying to tear itself free. Then came the sound, a deep metallic pulse, not a knock, not a misfire, something uglier. Mateo eased off the throttle instinctively as another car screamed past him along the outside wall. The crowd in the small grandstands barely reacted. At Riverstone Speedway, broken cars were almost part of the scenery now. By the time Mateo rolled back into the pit lane, thin smoke curled from beneath the hood. One of the sponsors, watching from behind the fence, muttered something to another man in a clean jacket before walking away without waiting for an explanation. Mateo tilled the engine and sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the wheel, breathing hard. The cockpit smelled like overheated oil and burnt rubber. Sweat trickled down the back of his neck, despite the cold October wind moving through the track. Another failed qualifying run. Another repair bill he couldn't afford. His crew chief, Darren, climbed over the pit wall and yanked off his headset. "You feel that in fourth?" Mateo nodded once. Whole damn car started shaking. Darren rubbed both hands over his face before looking toward the garage area. 3 younger mechanics were already arguing beside the open tool cabinets, tossing theories back and forth. Transmission, axle alignment, bent drive shaft. Nobody sounded confident. Across the lane, under the weak glow of a hanging workshop light, an old man swept the concrete floor outside a narrow garage stall. Slowly, methodically, like the noise and confusion around him belonged to another world. Mateo had noticed him earlier that morning. Everyone at Riverstone seemed to know him, but nobody really spoke to him unless they needed something welded or repaired cheap. The old mechanic wore faded coveralls stained permanently black around the sleeves. A gray knit cap covered most of his hair, and his shoulders carried the permanent forward lean of somebody who had spent decades bent over engines. He never looked up while sweeping. One of the younger mechanics glanced toward him and smirked. Maybe Walter can fix it with magic ears. A couple others laughed quietly. The old man kept sweeping. Darren ignored them and climbed beneath the chassis with a flashlight. A minute later, his voice echoed upward. Nothing obvious. Mateo stepped out of the car, pulling off his gloves. His knees ached from tension more than impact. He was 26, but lately he felt older every weekend. Results weren't coming, and Riverstone was probably his last shot before the entire season collapsed. The wind picked up across the speedway, carrying the smell of rain and fuel through the pit lane. Beyond the garages, faded billboards rattled softly against rusted bolts. Walter finally stopped sweeping, not because of the conversation, because the engine ticked once as it cooled. Just once. His head turned slightly. That was all. Then he walked over without hurry, dragging the broom beside him. "You ran her lean," he said quietly. Darren slid out from under the car. "Fuel mix is fine." Walter ignored him. His eyes stayed on Mateo instead. "When does the shake start?" Mateo hesitated. "Fourth gear, around 65, maybe 70. Walter crouched slowly beside the rear wheel. His knees cracked audibly. He placed one rough hand against the tire and spun it gently. The others exchanged looks behind him. The old mechanic listened, not casually, intently, like somebody listening for footsteps in another room. Then he stood. "Not the engine." One mechanic snorted. "You can tell that by touching a tire?" Walter looked toward the car again. "Drivetrain imbalance." "That doesn't make sense," Darren said immediately. "We already checked the shaft." Walter nodded once toward the suspension. "Not there." "Then where?" Walter's gaze moved underneath the chassis. Somewhere load shifts under acceleration. Silence. Not dramatic silence. Just the uncomfortable kind where nobody wants to admit they might not know something. Rain began tapping lightly against the metal roof overhead. Walter rested the broom against the wall. "You got 5 minutes?" Mateo looked at Darren. Darren sighed heavily. At this point, sure. Walter held out his hand. The keys. Mateo passed them over reluctantly. The old mechanic climbed into the driver's seat with visible stiffness. He adjusted nothing. Didn't even close the door fully. Instead, he turned the ignition halfway and listened. The engine idled unevenly for a moment, before settling. Walter placed 2 fingers lightly against the steering wheel. His eyes closed. Outside, one of the younger mechanics whispered something sarcastic under his breath. Walter remained perfectly still. The engine vibrated softly through the frame. Tick, hum, pulse. Then his eyes opened. Lift it. Darren frowned. What? Rear end, 6 inches. Something in Walter's tone made them obey without arguing further. The jack raised the car slowly. Walter crawled beneath the chassis himself, despite Darren offering to do it. For nearly 2 minutes, only the sound of rain and distant engines filled the garage. Then came Walter's voice from underneath. Flashlight. Darren handed it down. A moment later, Walter slid back out. Grease streaked across one sleeve. There. He pointed toward a narrow coupling near the differential housing. Darren leaned closer. The metal looked almost normal. Almost. Then Matteo saw it. The faint wobble along the edge. Tiny. Barely visible. How the hell? Darren muttered. Walter wiped his hands slowly with a rag. Hairline warp. That tiny thing caused all this? At 70 miles an hour? Walter shrugged faintly. Tiny becomes expensive. For the first time all day, Matteo felt something loosen inside his chest. Not relief yet, but possibility. Walter turned toward the workbench. We can rebalance it if the mount isn't damaged. You think it'll hold for tomorrow? Matteo asked. Walter paused before answering. If you stop fighting the car. Matteo frowned slightly. Walter looked directly at him now. You drive tense when you're scared. The words landed harder than expected. Matteo opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. Because the old man was right. Walter walked back toward his garage stall without another word. As he disappeared beneath the hanging light, Matteo noticed something pinned beside the doorway. An old newspaper clipping, curled at the edges. A younger version of Walter stood beside a race car, one hand resting on the hood. But the driver standing next to him had been ripped out of the photo completely. Only half an arm remained. Below it, the faded headline still showed through water stains. Tragedy at Riverstone Final. Career ends in fire. Matteo stared at it. Behind him, tools clanged softly against concrete. Then Walter's voice came from the shadows of the garage. Quiet, controlled. You should get some sleep, kid. Matteo looked toward him. For the first time that night, the old mechanic's face looked unsettled. Not angry, not embarrassed, afraid. And before Matteo could ask anything, Walter reached up and flipped off the workshop light. The man who walked away. Rain moved over Riverstone Speedway before sunrise. Not heavy enough to stop the practice runs, but enough to leave the entire track wrapped in cold mist. Water collected in shallow cracks along pit lane, while crew members shuffled through puddles, carrying fuel cans and tire warmers beneath flickering floodlights. Inside Walter's garage, an old radiator fan rattled loudly in the corner. Matteo sat on an overturned crate, drinking burnt coffee from a paper cup, while Walter worked beneath the rear suspension in silence. The old mechanic had been under the car nearly 40 minutes already. No music, no conversation, just the steady metallic sounds of tools turning somewhere beneath the chassis. Matteo finally broke the silence. You always work this early? Walter's voice echoed from underneath the car. Used to work earlier. That's supposed to mean something? No. Another wrench turn. Clink. Matteo leaned back against the wall and studied the garage again. In daylight, the place looked even older than he remembered from the night before. Cabinets dented from decades of use. Shelves packed with labeled coffee cans full of bolts and washers. Old racing tires stacked near the rear wall. And above the workbench, photographs. Not trophies, not framed certificates. Pictures. Cars covered in mud. Night races beneath giant floodlights. Pit crews smiling with exhausted faces. But every single photograph stopped around the same period. Nothing newer than 30 years old. Walter slid out from beneath the car slowly, wiping grease across a rag. You keep staring at those pictures long enough, they start charging rent. Matteo smirked faintly. You were really good at this once, huh? Walter tossed the rag aside. Still am. The answer came dry and immediate. Not arrogant, just factual. Matteo nodded slowly. Outside, engines began roaring alive across pit lane as practice sessions opened. Walter grabbed a weathered jacket hanging near the garage door. "Come on." "Where?" "You're driving wrong." Matteo frowned. "Pretty sure the problem was mechanical." Walter looked at him. "Both things can be true." 20 minutes later, Matteo's car rolled slowly onto the wet practice track. The sky hung low and gray above the speedway. Water sprayed lightly behind the tires as Matteo eased through the first lap. Walter stood against the pit wall with his hands buried inside his jacket pockets. Watching. Not the car. Matteo. After 2 laps, Walter motioned for him to pit. Matteo climbed out immediately. "Well, you grip too hard entering corners." Matteo blinked. "That's it? You anticipate the slide before it happens. I'm trying not to lose the rear, and because of that," Walter said calmly, "you upset the weight transfer before the car even commits." Matteo crossed his arms. "You can tell all that from 1 lap? You breathe different before left turns." The younger driver stared at him. Rain tapped softly against the hood between them. "You some kind of psychic now?" Walter almost smiled. "Cars tell on people." Before Matteo could answer, another voice cut through pit lane. "Well, I'll be damned." Both men turned. An older crew chief wearing a dark waterproof jacket stood several yards away holding a headset around his neck. Thick gray mustache, heavy posture, the kind of man who looked permanently tired. His eyes stayed fixed on Walter. "Haven't seen you near a pit wall since Clinton was president." Walter's expression hardened instantly. "Morning, Frank." Frank stepped closer slowly. "You working again?" "Just helping." "That what we're calling it?" Matteo sensed something tighten between them immediately. Not hostility exactly. Frank glanced toward the car. "You touched this thing?" Walter didn't answer. Frank looked back at Matteo instead. "Kid, if this old bastard tells you to listen to the engine, listen." Walter exhaled sharply. "Frank, I mean it." Frank pointed toward the car. "Last time he built one proper, nobody else could even stay on the same straightaway." A nearby mechanic overheard the conversation. Within minutes, whispers spread through pit lane. People started looking toward Walter's garage again, recognizing the name, remembering things. Walter noticed immediately, and hated it. The rest of practice became uncomfortable after that. 2 reporters wandered near the garage pretending not to stare. Rival teams glanced over more often than before. Even Darren looked at Walter differently now, not as some washed-up old mechanic, as somebody with a past. By afternoon, the rain intensified. Water hammered against the metal garage roof, while Walter adjusted suspension geometry using pieces of chalk directly on the concrete floor. Matteo watched him work. "You really built championship cars?" Walter kept drawing measurements. "Long time ago." "What happened?" The old mechanic stopped moving, only for a second. Then he resumed. "Racing happened." Matteo waited. Walter didn't continue. A loud crack of thunder rolled across the speedway. Electric lights flickered overhead. Then Frank appeared again in the garage doorway holding 2 coffees. He handed one silently to Walter. "You should tell him," Frank said quietly. Walter stared into the steaming cup. "No point." Frank leaned against the wall. "There's always a point." The garage stood silent except for rain and distant engines. Finally, Walter spoke. "My younger brother drove." Matteo stayed still. Walter's eyes remained fixed on the floor. "Daniel." Even saying the name sounded difficult. "He was better than me." Walter gave a faint shake of his head. "Better than most people." The old mechanic walked slowly toward the photographs on the wall. One night during the Riverstone final, weather turned bad halfway through the race. He paused. Cars started having issues. Matteo listened carefully now. Walter's voice stayed controlled, but something underneath it felt unstable. "I told him to stay out 2 more laps." The rain outside seemed louder suddenly. Frank lowered his eyes. Walter continued quietly. 3rd turn flooded. Rear suspension snapped at the wall. Matteo glanced toward the old newspaper clipping near the workbench. "Daniel died?" Walter nodded once. No drama, no emotional speech. Just a tired movement of the head. "I walked away after that." The radiator fan rattled loudly in the silence that followed. Matteo looked at the photographs again. Notice now how many of them included the same young driver standing beside Walter, always smiling, always half covered in grease. "Brothers." "You blamed yourself," Matteo said carefully. Walter looked toward the garage entrance where rainwater flowed slowly across cracked pavement. Still do. Another long silence settled between them. Then suddenly, Walter froze, completely. His eyes narrowed toward the rear suspension assembly. What? Walter stepped closer to the car. Fast now. Too fast for his age. He crouched beside the left rear wheel and ran his fingers across a mounting bracket. His face changed immediately. Cold, focused. Frank noticed it too. What is it? Walter didn't answer right away. He grabbed a flashlight and aimed it underneath the chassis. Tiny fresh scrape marks reflected back near the adjustment bolts. Not accidental. Deliberate. Matteo stepped forward. What happened? Walter stood slowly. His hands had started trembling slightly. Frank's expression darkened as he saw the marks. Oh no. Matteo looked between them. What? Walter's voice came out barely above a whisper. Someone touched the setup. Walter interrupted him. Because they used to do this during rain races. Matteo felt cold suddenly, despite the heat inside the garage. Walter kept staring at the damaged component, like he wasn't fully seeing the present anymore, like another memory had opened underneath the one he buried for 30 years. Then he finally said the words that made Frank go pale. They're using the same trick. When the engine finally speaks. By race night, Riverstone Speedway looked like it was running on memory alone. Half the floodlights above the backstretch flickered weakly through rain and fog. Water dripped steadily from the rusted grandstand rails, while small clusters of spectators huddled beneath ponchos and old team jackets. The announcer's voice crackled unevenly through blown speakers overhead. Final race of the season here at Riverstone. Static swallowed the rest. Inside Walter's garage, nobody spoke much. Matteo sat on a stool, tightening the straps on his gloves, while Darren checked tire pressures for the third time in 20 minutes. Frank leaned against the tool cabinet, smoking silently beside the open garage door. Walter stood over the exposed rear suspension with a flashlight in one hand, still searching, still thinking. Rainwater tapped softly against the aluminum roof above them. You found anything? Matteo finally asked. Walter didn't answer immediately. His fingers moved carefully along the mounting assembly. Then he straightened slowly. Yeah. Everybody looked up. Walter held up a tiny metal washer between two grease-darkened fingers. The thing was barely larger than a coin. Spacer shim, he said quietly. Darren frowned. So? Walter handed it over. Rear geometry shifts under hard compression. Frank muttered under his breath immediately. Matteo looked confused. Meaning what? Walter wiped his hands slowly. Means once you hit high speed in wet corners. He paused. The car stops behaving predictably. Silence settled across the garage. Rain hammered harder outside now. Matteo stared at the small piece of metal in Darren's palm. That could have caused a wreck? Walter nodded once. Easy. Darren looked toward the pit lane. Who the hell would do something like that? Walter's eyes drifted toward the distant garages across the track. Old memories moving behind them. Back then, he said quietly, teams did desperate things. Frank crushed his cigarette into the concrete floor. Most weren't trying to kill anybody. Walter didn't respond, because that wasn't the part haunting him. The part haunting him was Daniel. The final race, the rain, the wall. 30 years sitting inside his chest like shrapnel. Matteo stood. So what now? Walter looked at him carefully. You can pull out. The younger driver almost laughed. After all this? I'm serious. You think I came this far to park the car? This track gets dangerous in weather like this. And you still raced it. The words slipped out before Matteo could stop them. Instant regret followed. Walter's expression changed slightly. Not anger, pain. The garage went quiet again. Then Walter surprised everyone by nodding once. Yeah, he said softly. I did. Outside, engines began firing alive across pit lane one by one. Deep thunder rolling through wet night air. The race was about to begin. An hour later, Matteo sat strapped inside the cockpit, while rain streaked across the windshield netting. Water sprayed from passing tires during pace laps, turning the floodlights into smeared halos across the glass. Walter leaned through the driver window one final time. Listen carefully. Matteo nodded. If the rear starts floating entering turn 3, don't fight it. You really think I'm gonna remember all this at 100 miles an hour? Walter's face stayed calm. You will. Then he reached inside and tapped the dashboard twice. A small habit, almost unconscious. Matteo noticed it immediately. You used to do that with your brother's car too? Walter froze for half a second, then slowly nodded. The pace car lights switched off ahead. Engines roared louder instantly. Walter stepped back from the window, and for the first time in 30 years, he remained standing at pit wall as the green flag dropped at Riverstone Speedway. The race began violently. Cars sprayed rooster tails of water into the air, while tires fought for grip through flooded corners. Engines screamed beneath the storm as metal reflections flashed under broken floodlights. Matteo stayed cautious early. Too cautious. 2 cars passed him aggressively on lap 8. Darren cursed through the headset. "You're giving away positions." Walter grabbed the radio calmly. Let the track come to him. Matteo heard the old mechanic's voice through static and settled slightly. Lap by lap, the car began moving differently. Better. Smoother. Walter's adjustments were working. By lap 20, Matteo climbed into 3rd place. The crowd started noticing. People pressed against soaked railings beneath the rain, while the announcer's voice rose with disbelief. "That 22 car is flying through the corners tonight." Inside the garage, Frank stared at Walter. "You still got it." Walter barely heard him, because something else had caught his attention. A black sedan parked beyond the outer fence. An older man stood beside it beneath an umbrella, watching the race. Motionless. Walter recognized him instantly. Harold Vane, former sponsor liaison, one of the men involved after Daniel's crash. Frank noticed Walter staring. Oh hell. Walter's breathing slowed. Memories returned sharply now. Not clear at first. Fragments, radio static, rain on glass, voices yelling over each other. Then suddenly, understanding. Walter looked toward the track as Matteo entered turn 3. Exactly where Daniel died. And finally, after 30 years, Walter realized what he'd never allowed himself to consider. The sabotage hadn't been meant to cause a crash. It had been meant to force a pit stop. Teams used tiny setup imbalances during storms to scare drivers into pulling off dangerous tracks before conditions worsened. But Daniel never received the warning properly. Damaged radio equipment, miscommunication, chaos. Walter had carried guilt for a decision built on incomplete truth. Not innocence. But not murder either. His knees weakened slightly against the pit wall. Frank looked at him carefully. "You all right?" Walter didn't answer. On lap 32, Matteo's rear tires slipped hard entering turn 3. The car fishtailed violently across standing water. The crowd gasped. But instead of panicking, Matteo remembered Walter's words. "Don't fight it." He eased the wheel gently, balanced the throttle. The car straightened, barely. Walter closed his eyes briefly, not from fear, relief. By the final laps, Matteo ran 2nd, close enough to chase the leader, close enough to risk everything. Darren shouted through the headset, "You can catch him," but Walter grabbed the radio first. "No." Matteo heard him immediately. The old mechanic's voice remained calm. Ahead, rain intensified again across turn 3. Dangerous now. Matteo understood. For the first time in his life, winning didn't feel like the only thing that mattered. He backed off slightly, entering the corner, protected the car, protected himself. When the checkered flag waved, he crossed the line in 2nd place. And somehow, the crowd still stood. Not loud, not explosive, just people rising slowly beneath the rain, watching the 22 car roll into pit lane, watching Walter Briggs step forward to meet it. Matteo climbed from the cockpit soaked and exhausted. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Walter placed one grease-covered hand against the roof of the car. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. Around them, older mechanics began gathering near the garage entrance one by one. Men Walter hadn't stood beside in decades. Nobody gave speeches. Nobody mentioned redemption. The rain kept falling, and under the old floodlights of Riverstone Speedway, Walter finally looked less like a ghost haunting the track, and more like a man who had multiple chances. Chapter 4, The Garage with the Lights On. 3 weeks after the final race, Riverstone Speedway went quiet again. The temporary fences came down first. Then the sponsor banners disappeared from the outer walls one by one until only faded outlines remained where sunlight hadn't touched the metal for years. Wind pushed loose paper across the empty parking lot, while rainwater collected in the cracks beneath abandoned ticket booths. By mid-November, the place looked forgotten again. But every morning before sunrise, one light still came on near the far end of pit lane, Walter's garage. The bulb above the doorway flickered weakly in the cold, while the old mechanic stood inside, beside an engine block stripped nearly to the frame. A portable heater rattled in the corner, barely warming the concrete floor. The place smelled like machine oil and coffee, real coffee this time. Mateo had started bringing better beans after discovering Walter somehow survived for years drinking something that tasted burnt before it even touched the cup. "You keep making that face," Walter muttered without looking up. "I'm charging rent." Mateo smirked from across the garage. "You know normal people buy coffee makers built after 1982. This one still works. That's not the point." Walter shrugged faintly. "Usually is." The younger driver shook his head and returned to sorting bolts into labeled trays along the workbench. Outside, cold wind rattled the loose aluminum siding. For a while, neither man spoke. That silence had changed now. A month ago it felt guarded. Now it felt familiar. Not comfortable exactly. Walter Briggs probably wasn't comfortable around anybody for long, but the silence no longer carried loneliness inside it. The radio near the toolbox crackled softly, with an old country station buried beneath static. Somewhere deeper in the garage, a compressor kicked on with a tired groan. Mateo glanced toward the wall of photographs again. Walter still hadn't removed them, but one thing had changed. The torn newspaper clipping was gone. In its place sat a smaller photograph Mateo had never seen before. Two young men standing beside a dirt track racer beneath floodlights. Walter and Daniel. Brothers. The picture wasn't framed, just carefully cleaned. Mateo noticed Walter watching him see it. "You put that up today?" Walter tightened a bolt slowly before answering. "This morning." Mateo nodded once. Neither said anything else about it. The old mechanic wasn't suddenly transformed into someone emotional and open. Healing didn't work that way. Some mornings Walter still drifted into long silences that lasted hours. Certain sounds around the track still made him stop moving entirely. But the heaviness inside him had shifted. Not disappeared, shifted. Around noon, tires crunched outside on wet gravel. A truck pulled beside the garage. Frank stepped out, carrying a cardboard box under one arm. "Told myself I wasn't coming back here," he muttered while entering. "Apparently I'm a liar." Walter didn't look up from the engine. Always were. Frank grinned. Mateo noticed immediately how different the older men looked now compared to race week. Less haunted. Less tense. Still tired, though. That seemed permanent. Frank dropped the box onto the workbench. "What's this?" Mateo asked. "Found some old parts cleaning out storage." Walter finally walked over. The moment he opened the box, his expression changed. Inside sat old racing components wrapped carefully in newspaper. Hand-machined brackets, carburetor pieces, suspension parts from another era, and beneath them, a weathered headset. Walter picked it up slowly. The same style Daniel used decades earlier. Frank rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Figured you should have it." The garage grew quiet. Walter turned the headset over carefully in his hands. One ear cushion remained split from age. "You kept this?" Frank shrugged, couldn't throw it away. For several seconds, Walter said nothing. Then quietly, "Thank you." Simple words, but Mateo sensed immediately how difficult they were for him. Frank cleared his throat fast, uncomfortable with emotion. "So," he looked around the garage, "this place officially open again or what?" Mateo smirked. "Depends." "On?" Walter finally set the headset down gently atop the workbench. "Depends if he ever learns not to overdrive corner entry." Mateo groaned. "You've been saying that for 3 weeks. Because you keep doing it." Frank burst out laughing. The sound echoed warmly through the garage. And for the first time, Mateo heard Walter laugh too. Small, rough, short-lived, but real. Outside, clouds drifted slowly over the empty speedway. The track no longer held races, at least officially. County officials still argued about redevelopment plans. Some investors wanted warehouses. Others talked about tearing everything down entirely. But every few days now, local drivers still showed up quietly asking for repairs. Word had spread after the final race. Not about miracles, not about legends, about honesty, about an old mechanic who could hear problems nobody else noticed, and about a younger driver who stayed. A teenage kid arrived towing a battered dirt car behind an old pickup truck. The front bumper hung crooked and one fender had been duct-taped together badly enough it looked ready to detach on the drive over. The kid climbed out nervously. You guys busy? Walter looked toward the damaged car. Usually. The teenager shifted awkwardly. My uncle said you might know why the engine keeps choking in second gear. Walter wiped his hands slowly with a rag. What's it sound like? The kid blinked. Walter walked toward the garage entrance. Start it. The engine coughed alive outside. Rough idle. Thin exhaust note. Tiny hesitation between revs. Walter listened for maybe 5 seconds. Then he nodded toward the hood. Vacuum leak. The teenager stared at him. You can tell already? Walter shrugged. Mostly. Mateo smiled quietly from the workbench, because now he understood something nobody else at Riverstone had fully understood before. Walter never listened only to engines. He listened to people through them. Fear, pressure, pride, carelessness, hope. Machines carried all of it. The evening darkened slowly around the speedway. One by one, the old floodlights along pit lane flickered alive automatically, though half of them no longer worked. Their reflections stretched across wet asphalt, like fading memories refusing to disappear completely. Walter stepped outside the garage and looked down the empty track. Cold air moved through the silence. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled softly beyond the hills. Mateo walked out beside him. You miss it? Walter kept his eyes on the speedway. Every day. Mateo nodded. Then, after a moment, you think they'll reopen it someday? Walter considered the question carefully. Finally, he said, places like this don't stay alive because of money. What keeps them alive? The old mechanic looked back toward the garage, toward the lights, the tools, the sound of another engine waiting to be repaired. People. Inside the garage, the teenage driver laughed nervously as Frank argued with him about tire pressure. The heater rattled loudly again. Metal clanged against concrete. And under the fading lights of Riverstone Speedway, Walter Briggs stood quietly listening to the sounds of the garage breathing around him, not like a man trapped in the past anymore, but like someone finally willing to keep building a future inside it.